way that we handle different manuscripts if they don't have quite the same text as one another, looking, of course, at the New Testament. So the point, of course, is that there are lots and lots of different manuscripts for the New Testament, 5,800 or more in Greek. There's a whole lot more in different languages, where you can look at what the language is translated from. But they don't always produce the same text. So that's just some of the Greek ones. Sometimes one manuscript will have a different text from another manuscript, and this is how we try and work out what the genuine reading is, what the original reading is likely to be. So the kinds of witness we've got several different varieties of witness, and the first thing to do is to become familiar with the different kinds of witness that there are to the text. So let's look at the different categories. The oldest one is the papyri. A papyrus is a manuscript written on papyrus. There are not too many of those around for the New Testament, problem being that papyrus is fairly fragile stuff. It doesn't disappear the moment you get it damp. It lasts a few hundred years, but even so, there's not many papyri left over from the very earliest days of the New Testament. And of course, papyrus went out of fashion, replaced by other things you could write on, like paper, later on. But the earliest manuscripts we've got were written on papyrus. It had one big advantage: it was cheap. And the early Christians didn't have much money, so they wrote on papyrus. Every manuscript has an identifier. It's called a siglum. If you go to a catalogue, you can find which manuscript you're dealing with, and papyruses always start off with a P, and then there's a number, which is usually as a superscript. And if you've got the font, you'll find that it's a black letter P, what people often refer to as Gothic script. But it looks a bit like that. And a lot of them, because papyrus is so fragile, are just fragments. So that one's part of John's Gospel. That's a papyrus from somewhere around 150 AD. There are lots of these papyri. So some of them are fragmentary, probably more than half, but some of them are quite substantial. So that one is P66. That's an almost complete copy of John's Gospel. That comes from probably just before 200 AD. There's another one, P75, which is Luke and John. It misses the end of John and it misses the beginning of Luke. But that one is just a little bit later than this one. That's also reckoned to be around 200. And the big finds are the Chester Beatty Papyri and the Bodmer Papyri. Between them, they produce almost the whole of the New Testament. P45 is a pretty fragmentary, and you can see that P66 has got the corners missing. Actually, there are a couple of pages out, but nonetheless, we've got a pretty good picture of the text of the New Testament from just after 200. Some of those are before 200. Some of them, like the general epistles and the Revelation, are just a little bit after 200 AD. But nonetheless, that's where we have all the text of the New Testament. Now, the other very early set of manuscripts are the Uncial Manuscripts. And what happened is that the church became official. Constantine picked it up, and he devoted resources to it. As a result, the church had more money, and it could afford parchment. And so manuscripts start to be written on parchment. Parchment's made from effectively leather. It's made from sheepskin or goat skin, heavily treated, but you only get about 4 folio pages from each animal. So it's expensive stuff. They're written in this rather awkward looking script. Every letter is a capital letter. There are no spaces between the words. It takes some reading. You can read it. It's at least clear, but nonetheless, it's a bit awkward. The papyri are written in a similar script, but because of the roughness of the surface, it's a slightly different looking handwriting. The church starts using them in the 4th century. The parchment manuscripts go way back before then, but the church itself doesn't start using it until the 4th century, so you don't get biblical manuscripts earlier than that. And in the 10th century, things change. The script changes, and so the manuscripts change to go with it. And there's our sort of one of our best Uncial Manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus. It's considering how old it is, it's amazingly well preserved. The binding, I think, is rather later, but the pages are still doing very well. And again, every manuscript, every Uncial manuscript, it has an identifier. Originally, they started off by giving them letters, so they put them in what they thought was the order of age. They thought the oldest one was the Codex Alexandrinus, so that got the letter A, and Codex Vaticanus got the letter B, and so on. Ephraemi Scriptus, that's a palimpsest. Someone wanted to write out a copy of the Sermons of Ephraim, so they had an old manuscript of the Bible, an old New Testament in Uncial script, and they scrubbed that one so that the writing wasn't very clear, and then wrote on top of it. But it's actually legible, or most of it is anyway, so that one's another example, and so on. Sometimes it was partial, so the Codex Bezae was given letter D, so was the Codex Claromontanus, but Bezae has the Gospels and Acts and the general epistles, so it's got a superscript E for the Gospels, Evangelion, Evangelia, and A for Acts, and P for the Pauline epistles. So that's how it started. Then they ran out of letters. They found more than 26 of them, so they went to Greek letters, at least where they were different. Of course, a capital alpha looks just like an H, so they couldn't do that one. So they soon ran out of Greeks. Tischendorf, when he found the Codex Sinaiticus, said that was earlier than the others, so he ought to go in a different letter altogether, and he called that Aleph. It's the only one in Hebrew, but they were running out of letters, so they went over to numbering them, and to distinguish that they're Uncial manuscripts, they have a 0 in front of the number. So if you get a 01, that's Codex Sinaiticus. It's also Aleph. And then just to add to the fun, sometimes the manuscript's corrected. So the scribe who wrote Codex Sinaiticus, or there were several scribes, 4 of them at least. The one who wrote most of the New Testament was a fairly dozy character, couldn't spell for toffee. And then someone went over afterwards and corrected it and improved the spelling in a few places, and we had a corrector. And then other people have gone over it since and corrected it later. So someone went over towards the end of the 4th century or the beginning of the 5th century and made a lot of corrections. Somebody else went over it in the 6th to 7th century. Someone else went over it in the 12th century. And in fact, it's more than one in each case from the handwriting, but nonetheless, they lump together, and you find them given superscript. So the star means the original text, and the numbers are the different correctors. Sinaiticus has more correctors than almost anything else. After the uncials, we get minuscules, still written on parchment, although later ones are written on paper. They're written in the minuscule script. There's an example. So the minuscule script has upper and lowercase letters. The spaces between the words makes it a lot easier to spot what you're reading. It has these accents on. You can see all these accents. They tell you where the breathing is. So the difference between and ha is just an accent, but it's a breathing or an aspiration mark. They're written in as well. Of course, That's whatever the scribe thought it was. They weren't in the Uncial manuscripts. And this kind of script appears in the 9th century, and there's then quite an industry of turning Uncial manuscripts into minuscules. So you get things like 33, where they've taken a really old Uncial manuscript and rewritten it as a minuscule. So quite often there's a long gap between the exemplar, the thing they're copying, and the minuscule manuscript. So the early minuscules are usually copies of things that are 5 or 6 or even 7 centuries earlier than the manuscript that's being written. And they're identified by a number. That one's 580. If it was an uncial, it would have a 0 in front of it. Minuscule just has the number on its own. Next kind are lectionaries, and what happens here is that that people had reading plans, just like the Bible Companion. Church of England has one as well. They're these reading plans, and when someone was reading the Bible out to the community, quite often happened that they would do it at meals, for example. Then they would follow this reading plan, and what the lectionaries do is they write the Bible out in the order of the plan. So if you had a Christadelphian lectionary, you'd have the first bit of it, you'd have Genesis 1 and 2, then you'd have Matthew 1 and then you have Psalms 1 and 2, then you'd have Matthew 1 and 2, and then you'd have Genesis 3 and 4, and so on, so that it's written out in the order of reading rather than in the conventional order that the Bible is written out in. So it's very good for checking the text of a particular bit. It's not so good for putting the chapters in order, and some lections are miss out parts. So sometimes you'd find that the reading plan didn't have the whole of the New Testament in. So if something's missing from a lectionary, it doesn't guarantee it was missing from the Bible at that time that they had. It just means they didn't read it. And this happens, you get early on, you get Uncial manuscripts, which are lectionaries. You get ones written in minuscule. That's a minuscule there. And identified again in the catalogues, they have a script L in front of them. When I'm typing, I use a pound sign. There's another one. That's an early one. That's rather a nice one, I think. And there are about 2,500 of these lectionaries around, which get consulted as textual witnesses. And then you've got versions. So the word version means a translation into another language. So when you think about the Authorized Version or the King James Version, it just means translation, or the Revised Standard Version or the English Standard Version, or any of those. The word version means translation into a language that's not the original Greek. So they translated it into whatever, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and that's known as a version. And there are lots and lots of these ancient languages and lots of manuscripts in those languages. So my favorites among these are the old Latin versions. So these are translated before the Vulgate. The Vulgate comes up in about 400 AD. These are older than that, because then there's an official translation, which is what everybody uses. Some of them go back to the 2nd century, definitely. I think I have evidence there's at least one in the 1st century that was a translation, although we don't have it anymore, but there are quotations of it in some of the church fathers. You get Syriac versions. That's the Syrian version of Aramaic. The Vulgate, of course, is well known. There are lots of manuscripts about it. I always say it's the best modern translation. Coptic, still in use in the Egyptian church, although not many people read it. And then you get all sorts of other odd languages translated to, and you can translate those back into Greek. That's called the Vorlage, the text from which it was translated, and you can then compare that with other manuscripts in Greek, and that helps to produce ideas of what the text should be. And we've got more than 18,000 manuscripts to go at here. Now, last one, citations. The Bible was cited by other writers. So people wrote commentaries, people wrote books on teaching, and they quote it from the Bible in it. So that's a part of a book, and that's Irenaeus of Lyon, apparently, although I have no idea whether he really looked like that. He, writing about 180, writes various books which quote extensively from the Bible. And so these many different ancient writers, you can take the quotes out of them and you can look at them. And I'm told that all of the New Testament, apart from 11 verses, some people say 13 verses, are known from citations. Some people say you could reconstruct the New Testament from the citations. I think that'd be a bit difficult because you wouldn't know what order the different bits would to go in. But the text is there, and this is useful comparison. And you can also, where the person that was working on the book, the father you're citing, lived, so you can see what the text was in his part of the world. Warning, though, that the church fathers often don't have a Bible in front of them. They're quoting from memory, and their memory sometimes isn't that good. So you can get some not very exact quotations of the New Testament involved. But as secondary witnesses, they're quite useful characters to have. You can see what's going on in different parts of the places where there were Bibles of the world. Now, one of the big objections that comes up is that most of the manuscripts are late. That's quite true. This is a slightly old picture. There are only 5,197 manuscripts on the chart. We now know that of more than there were in 2000. Bart Ehrman produced a catalogue which had 5,800 manuscripts in. We've found more since then. And you can see that the number of manuscripts in each of the centuries early on isn't particularly high, and then it shoots up in the 12th century, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. You've got these huge numbers of manuscripts written. But there are still a lot of manuscripts early on. They always talk about percentages. A high proportion of the manuscripts are late. That's true. But there's also a large absolute number, which is early. And that's the important thing. We have plenty of early manuscripts. So let's think about modern texts, the texts that our Bibles are translated from. And the first of these to be published and released was by Erasmus, and that comes out in 1516. There's another one earlier than that, but the Catholic Church sat on it. That's the Jimenez translation, or Jimenez collection, which is possibly even better than the Textus Receptus, but as it wasn't published, it didn't get used. And this is the one that the Authorized Versions translated from, along with all the other sort of Tudor Bibles. The name Textus Receptus is part of the publishing blurb. The printer is advertising his book. He says it's the text received everywhere. And in 1633, that becomes the name of that text. And it's only based on 6 manuscripts. They're not particularly early manuscripts. Some of them are 12th century, some of them are 15th century. And initially, Erasmus put them together from just those 6 manuscripts. And notice that they don't all cover all of them. So for the Gospels, you've got manuscript 1, you've got manuscript 2E, and you've got manuscript 7, and that's it. Later on, after he'd produced his text, he found 2 more, so he has another one for the Gospel, another 2 for the Gospels. It's still a jolly good text, but it's a little limited. It doesn't let you know what extent of variation there is in the manuscripts. People started to discover other manuscripts quite a lot later, but 100th century afterwards, you've got John Mill produces one with a few extra manuscripts there. You've got Codex Alexandrinus in it, for example. And then the numbers start to come up. Tischendorf works very hard and pushes the number of known manuscripts up, produces an edition with lots and lots of different readings in the margins. Gregory produces the numbers for these manuscripts. That's the catalogue with the numbers going on. And then there's Ehrman's database. He's part of the United Bible Society committee that works out the new UBS text. Will come to that soon. So the number of manuscripts is shooting up hugely with the date. So in the 1850s and after that, you've got huge numbers of manuscripts being discovered. And in 1881, well, they've been working at it for a bit. A couple called Westcott and Hort produce a different text of the New Testament. It's not very different, but it's a bit different. They're very, very impressed by the early manuscripts that have been discovered at the time, things like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. And because these are very old, they rely on those particularly much, and you get a text which is very much based on those two manuscripts. That's the text that's used in the revised version. In 1881, they released their printed version of their text at the same time as the translation, which is the revised version. And we'll make a standard version if you're in America. And that's the sort of most extreme text in one direction. If you compare that with the authorized version, then you can see the largest possible extent of variation you can get by looking at manuscripts. And you have to be quite alert to spot the differences. It's not a huge set of differences. In fact, Westcott and Hort's text then vanishes. Nobody uses it again. And we get other improved texts produced from lots of manuscripts. And the big one that is now in use comes really from the work of these two gentlemen, Eberhard Nestle and Christadelphian. And that's not the Westcott and Hort text. It is influenced by it. It's influenced by the Textus Receptus as well. So modern versions don't come from the Westcott and Hort text. They tend to come from the Nestle-Aland text. And in 1961, there's a big meeting of a committee which puts together the manuscripts they've got and produces something that's called the United Bible Society's text, the UBS text. And that is the one that now is most commonly used as the base text for translations. And you can get it in two versions, the Nestle-Aland version, which is exactly the same text as the United Bible Society's version. That's the latest edition. I haven't got one. I've only got the 4th edition, but the 5th edition's just come out. Interestingly, you don't seem to be able to get hold of a proper version, only a popular edition, which isn't going to have the apparatus. And then it comes out different editions of it. Well, the editions have the same text, so it's the same translation, but the apparatus varies. Now, the apparatus is the lists of other manuscripts that have other readings. So that's the apparatus for the Nestle-Aland. It's the 26th edition. There's the 27th edition around, but I happen to have a 26th edition around when I photographed this. And so, for example, this is in 1 Peter chapter 1 for verse 8, the first variant. You could either have the text or Papyrus P72, Minuscule 429, original not the corrector, Minuscule 1852, and a small number of Byzantine manuscripts have Dokimon instead of the official text. The United Bible Society's one is a bit clearer, so there we are, same verse, and you can see that all these manuscripts here have Dokimion, so that 1 iota difference, but these ones here have Dokimon, so there's a slight difference in spelling, and you can see which of the manuscripts have that word and which of the manuscripts have this word. 3 of them have that word, the others all have this word. Notice there are 1 or 2 that are groups of manuscripts. Biz there, that's the Byzantine text. That's the most common translation text. Lect for lectionaries. Lectionaries all have this, and so on. Armenian translations, Syriac, there are two different translations, but both of them would translate back to this. So the apparatus is useful in knowing which variants go in which manuscript. Now, let's think about text types. This comes up a lot in discussion. When Tischendorf was finding his manuscripts, they tended to, there weren't that many of them, and they tended to be clumped together as particular types. And they decided that what happened was there were certain centers of the church which had a set of manuscripts that were used as exemplars that other people copied from. So you got the revision in Alexandria, that was the Alexandrian text. You got the original, it kept held in Byzantium or nearby, that was the Byzantine text, and another one held in Rome, which produced the Western text. And certainly manuscripts from those areas do tend to be fairly similar. And the great arguments was there a Caesarean text that was different from the other texts or not. Problem is that we discovered more and more manuscripts, and people started to see problems with this. You still find that if you get, there's not many textbooks on textual criticism, but if you get one, it still talks about these as though they are distinct text types which never mix. It isn't like that. What's happened is that handling all these manuscripts has become very difficult. There are just so many of them. So we're starting to use computers to do that. And using the computer to look at the different manuscripts, you can construct a table of the differences between different manuscripts, and you can measure how many variations there are, what proportion of variation of readings vary. You're only looking at places where there are variations. It looks as though sometimes there's 100% difference. It's only 100% difference in the places where you're considering that there's much variation. And you can then use statistical techniques, multidimensional scaling, if you're into statistics, to create a map from that. You can do it in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and so on. Turns out 2 dimensions is mainly enough to express the variation in manuscripts. So if you look at that, the Western texts are coloured, the ones considered Western are coloured purple, and you can see it takes up this proportion of the map. The map itself is a purely theoretical construct. The numbers mean very little, but they do group manuscripts together. The most similar ones are close together. The most different ones are far apart. But interestingly enough, they match up with what was thought of the Western text type, what was thought of as a Byzantine text type, and so on. Interesting thing, if you turn that on its side, Alexandria is at the bottom, Byzantium top right, and the Rome would be up on the left, and there's a bit of a gap in the middle where it's the Mediterranean. So it does seem to follow the geography quite well. When I calculated that, no idea of geography was included in the calculation. So for about 10 years before I retired, I had a whole bunch of students feeding in manuscripts into the project and working out better ways of calculating the spread. It was quite an interesting set of studies to do. The Byzantine text comes down here, sometimes known as the majority text. A huge number of manuscripts were made for use in Byzantium. That's because Byzantium was a wealthy city. It spoke Greek. And a lot of these manuscripts are very, very similar and come from a small number of originals. And it's a very clear, this is a text type. This is the official definition almost of a text type. And it becomes the official text of the Greek Orthodox Church. And we call it Byzantine text because people we know lived in Byzantium quote from that text. And nearly every Greek manuscript you're going to find, well, not nearly every one, a large proportion of them are Byzantine manuscripts, have this very common text. And it's nothing to do with because that's the most accurate text, because the Byzantines have more money to spend on making copies of the Bible. They spoke Greek. Alexandria stops copying in the 7th century because it's overrun by the Muslims, and the Muslims don't really appreciate copying the Bible. So the rate of copying goes right down to almost zero. So we can treat the Byzantine text almost as though it's just one witness rather than thousands of witnesses. And you can then use that to analyze a variation. So this is for Matthew 24, verse 26. The passage, let's just read that out. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 26. And in the English Standard Version, that reads, so if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness. I seem to have got the wrong passage there. I've got the wrong, I've written the wrong passage up there. It's there we go, it's the 36. But concerning that day and that hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now, if you've got an authorized version, it won't have nor the Son in. If you have a modern version, it will have nor the Son in. That's because some manuscripts include this word, this phrase, nor the Son. Other ones don't include it. So let's look at we'll look at that later on, but you can color in the different colors, the witnesses that have nor the Son and ones that don't have it in, and you can see how they spread out among the set of variants that there is. Again, you can see that the ones that have nor the Son in the Alexandrian and Western ones, they're now poles in a spread. Those tend to have nor the Son in, and the Byzantine texts and the Vulgate tend to have leave it out. So let's look at how we might analyze variations. So 1 John chapter 2 verse 23. In the authorized version, it would read, whosoever denieth the Son, the same hath not the Father. And then you got a whole line in italics. Italics means it's not in the original Greek text. It says, but he that acknowledgeth the Son hath the Father also. And that isn't in the Textus Receptus. It isn't in the Greek that's the authorized version takes it from. The authorized version's taken that from the Vulgate. So let's look at the two different variants. Some Greek manuscripts have it looking like that. That's the whole thing. It includes the bit in italics. Some of them have the shorter bit. It misses out the part in italics. And we can make a list of witnesses. That's not a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, but we can write down the variants. So we know that the full variant appears in the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Alexandrinus, the Codex Vaticanus, and so on, various minuscules. It appears in the Coptic translation, in the early Latin translations, and in fact in quite a few Vulgates, mostly in the official Vulgate, and in the Syriac. And it's got it quoted by Origen and Cyprian, two early church fathers. But the short variant appears in the Byzantine manuscripts, which there are many hundreds, if not many thousands. Some manuscripts of the Vulgate, some manuscripts of the Bohairic. So actually there are more witnesses supporting the short variant because M stands for a huge number of manuscripts. But the earlier ones support the long variant. And normally I would go ahead then and plot a chart and start to decide how what the manuscripts look like. But there's something that sticks out from this text, and that's here you get the same set of words appearing twice. And this is a common kind of scribal error. The way that scribes wrote, they would write a bit and they'd look at the original text and write a bit more, look at the original text and so on, probably dip their pen in the ink every time. And what's happened here, what's a common idea, is that the chap writes ton patera eche down there, and then he dips his pen in the ink, looks away, and then he looks back, and his eye comes back to the same set of words here, and he misses out the text in between. So he writes that out and thinks he's finished. And that's a common scribal error. It's got a name. It's called a homoteleuton, same ending in Greek. So it's a place where a line typically ends with those words, but it might not be a line. It's the end of a passage which matches the end of the bit just before the passage, and the scribe's eye slips from one to the other and he doesn't copy it. And that's a common error. If you can spot a common error like that, then you know that the longer text is correct. And the people who did the authorized version spotted that, although they wouldn't have any Greek manuscripts which contained the full variant. They've got that from the Vulgate, but they got it right. So how are we going to analyze our variants? Well, first thing you do is the obvious thing. You look at the bit of text and you make a list of all the different variants, and then which witnesses support each of those variants. Then if you've got something that only one witness has, unless that witness is something like the majority text, you say, right, well, it's only been copied once, it's almost certainly wrong, so you get rid of those. And then you say, are there any scribal errors? Are there any of these homotelutons like we just saw? Are there any? There's a homoarchon, which is the same start of the text, matches the bit of text missing, matches the beginning of the next bit. Again, people's eye slips from one to the other, and so on. There are well-known scribal errors, and if you spot one of those, then you can eliminate that. And quite often it'd be like the previous one, where we can eliminate things straight away, and there's no problem left. If what you've got left is still not clear, you then have to say, well, all right, how did each variant appear? Which variant best explains the other variants? And that's what you're looking for. So if you've got in the map of variants, you find that one reading is just a small number stuck together, then that's probably one manuscript that's got that error in, which is then copied by a whole lot of other manuscripts, but they're all very similar. So that's probably not an original. These are only probabilities, unfortunately. You have to think carefully. And that's where the map of witnesses comes in. If you've got something that only appears in 13th century manuscripts and later and doesn't appear any earlier than that, again, it's probably not original. It's not a guarantee, but it weighs towards it's probably not original. So knowing the dates of the witnesses is quite important. But of course, if you've got something like Minuscule 33, that's almost certainly a copy from a 4th or 5th century original. It's witness to a very early text. You can then look at things like the style. Does the bit that you're looking at fit in with the style of the writer? Is he saying something that writer often says, or is it something that's way out totally different from anything you get? Is it a word that the chap never ever uses anywhere else? Does it make nonsense of the verse you're looking at? And then another one to think about is, has the scribe got a reason to change the text? Does it that the text is going to disagree with his fundamental beliefs, so it's going to change it anyway? And from that, you can put together a narrative and you can see how things go. So let's look at an example. Philippians chapter 1, verse 14. And the variation around at the end, they spoke the word without fear. And there are three variants there. Did they speak the word without fear? Or did they speak the word of the Lord without fear? Or did they speak the word of God without fear? And there are three variants there. And it's a question of possibly inserting one word, kurio, the word of the Lord, or two words, totheo, the God. Greek grammar doesn't always put articles the same place as English grammar. It doesn't change the meaning of the passage. It doesn't make any difference to our understanding of what's going on. They're speaking the word without fear, whether it's just the word or whether it's the word of the Lord or whether it's the word of God. It's the same word, the same thing they're talking about. So we go and we plot them out on the map and see what's happening. And you can see that the word of God, the one in blue, is pretty widespread, but there are two clusters in red and one in yellow. And that's a very tight cluster, the one in yellow there. That corresponds to the word of the Lord. So that probably comes from a copying error. Their 9th century manuscripts. It's probably a late-ish copying error. Their uncials are F and G. So probably we can eliminate the word of the Lord. It's either the word or the word of God. And there we've got two clusters. So if an error was made, it was made twice. And it's difficult to imagine how that the word of God would come in there. Why they make the same error twice. So if it's an error, it's happened twice. So they've missed out of God. They've done it twice, and they've done it in the same place. It seems more likely that that's the original text, but someone then very, very early on, because Aleph there is a very early manuscript, 4th century one, someone missed out the word of God and put it in. And you got that. So you put the word of God in to the text, and that's then become the most common copying. It's not a very convincing story. I must admit, I am slightly dubious about this one. I would give it a low degree of confidence, but I can understand where it comes from. So if you look at it, people decide that really the text ought to read the word based on that, and it'd be easy for a scribe to add the word of God, perhaps in the margin, to explain what the word was, and that's become in the text as main part of it. So what you get is what you mostly do get in your translations. You get the word of God. Now, I'm actually running out of time. So I will have a very, very quick look at this one. Matthew 24, verse 36, got the verse right this time. Concerning that day and hour, there's no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And the question is, should the text nor the Son be in there? And there are only two variants, nor the Son or omitted. Now, it's unlikely that someone did that just by mistake when they were writing. They must have deliberately either put it in or taken it out. Now, Mark 13, verse 32 is very similar, and it contains the words, nor the Son. So we know that the Son doesn't know. It doesn't change anything. It says only the Father knows, so that implies the Son doesn't know anyway. So it's not changing the meaning of the passage, but nonetheless, it could have been that someone was reading it, remembered reading Mark 13, verse 32, and included that phrase because it was in Mark. It's not very likely because Mark was not read very much in medieval times. They always read Matthew, they read Luke a lot, but Mark is not read that frequently, and it's missing from a lot of collections or manuscripts. Often have the other Gospels, but not Mark. It's not very likely it's an accidental omission, but it might be deliberate. And again, you can see that it's omitted. There's two clusters. There's the Byzantine cluster down here and the Vulgate. What's going on? Well, the oldest witnesses are down the Alexandrian one. They have nor the Son in, although corrected takes it out again. and the 5th century for missing it out. 5th century is still pretty early in these manuscripts. But, well, we said assimilation from Mark's not very likely. But if you're copying it down and you're really keen on the doctrine of the Trinity, then you might not like that little phrase, and so it gets missed out. So it shows that something Jesus didn't know. And that seems a very likely explanation, that some scribe, very keen on the doctrine of the Trinity, removes the phrase deliberately, and that gets done when people are comparing two manuscripts, or maybe just accidentally, but when people compare two manuscripts, because they have a predisposition to say the Son knew everything, he must be doing God, they therefore pick the variant that doesn't include that bit of text. But probably the real text is probably that. And that leads on to the idea of an Orthodox corruption. And that's a situation where the scribe is very invested in some teaching, and as a result he changes the text of the Bible to fit that teaching. It doesn't happen very often, very, very rare, and they're very easy to detect because they only happen in a few of the manuscripts, and they don't fit the style of the rest of the document. So there's only a few witnesses. They tend to be in small clusters. Sometimes they're singular readings. They just happen in one manuscript. Often someone says, "Don't be silly. I know you like it, but it wasn't." And then corrects it, and they have a doctrinal slant behind them. But so if you look at one of these critical texts, you can very quickly spot the Orthodox readings, and in general they don't get through. These Orthodox corruptions haven't made it into the Bible. But modern texts have a couple. One of them is John chapter 5 verse 7, very famous passage, the three witnesses, these three are one. It says that one is not in many Greek manuscripts. It's not in any early Greek manuscripts. It's only in ones that are very late. And another one appears in the 1970s in the critical texts, and it's another one where they John 1 verse 18 in the vast majority of manuscripts is hugely anti-Trinitarian, and they make a change to it that allows it to support the doctrine of the Trinity, possibly. So look out for those two, but in general, there isn't a real problem. So let's summarize what we've seen. The readings of lots of different witnesses to the text New Testament available to anyone. All you have to do is to get hold of United Bible Society's text, 5th edition available, but looking on Amazon, they're not selling the kind with the apparatus, they're only selling the text at the moment. Or I have a Nestle-Aland 27. I don't think there's a later edition out yet, but maybe there is. The other thing is to think about is that we now have very much improved way of comparing manuscripts, that if you get a textbook on textual criticism, it will tend to be thinking about it in the way people thought about it in the 1960s, when they couldn't use a computer to analyze it, when they were left to what one human being could handle in their brain at a single time. Now we can look at it sort of mechanically and go through lots of calculations on it. So the older text types model has been modified, but that hasn't hit the textbooks yet. And we can look at lots of witnesses. The other thing is that we got so many manuscripts that we can be pretty confident about nearly all our decisions on the text. What we get, what the text is like, is pretty much the same as the original text really was. It's not like they find any surprises. You're not going to find that little bit of a discovery shows the text will be quite different. It isn't. What we've got is a text that's very like the original text. And the other thing is, if you've got a modern version, a modern translation of the Bible, look out, because the translators tend to believe that they know better than the original text and tend to slide in slightly dodgy readings into their translations. So There we go.